Right, thanks a lot, Jeff. That's great. I'm delighted to be here again. So my third year in a row. I had some fun getting here this time. I had 44 hours journey instead of 24 because the Dublin Airport Authority, just when my plane was going on the runway, decided to shut all flights. So anyway, but I got here. So hopefully what I say is interesting to you. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about engineering problem solving in the complex problem solving sphere. And just to give a flavor, he asked me for the last couple of years, could I do something like this? So the first half of the talk will be around 15 minutes on that kind of vector. And then the second half will be more back to heart disease causes, solutions, and stuff like that, which you'll be more familiar with. So firstly, disclosures. Very important to disclose that one of Ireland's richest entrepreneurs, he owns and runs a $600 million business, set up the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity in Ireland because he had a personal experience with coronary calcification scanning and his own extensive heart disease. And he decided to set up a charity and invest money in trying to save other people in the way that he was saved. So he's fully funding me now. I finished my corporate role at the end of January. So big kudos to David Bobbett. So, and we have no financial ties to the imaging industry, although I'll talk a little about imaging. So this is all philanthropy. So part one, engineering problem solving, just a primer. You might wonder, some of you perhaps, how is it that in, for instance, the airline technology industry, they've reduced the number of fatalities and incidents by a factor of 60 over the last 50 years, right? How do you do that? It's a 98% reduction. And the way they do it is they focus inexorably and mercilessly on root cause and understanding every cause and eliminating it. And that's how they get those massive results in the face of extraordinary complexity, right? And their profit drives that approach. They will not make profit, they will not survive if they don't go that way. So if you look at the heart disease kind of world over the last 50 years, it's rather different. Now there has been huge investment into studying and researching, and there's been a lot of look at root cause. But there's also been a lot of focus on driving towards mitigating the problem. You know what I mean? Reducing it and modifying it rather than eliminating it. And also in that business, the medical business, the profit driver actually favors if you focus on mitigating and patching up and doing operations on people who've had heart attacks. That's where all the money is. If you actually prevent it, ironically, the profit drops. So it's very different than the airline industry in a few different ways. So I'm going to first say rule zero for engineering problem solving if you're a master problem solver in the complex sphere, and it's the Pareto principle. So roughly speaking, 20% of the factors in a multi-factor problem will give you 80% of the root cause and 80% of the results. We can't find all of the factors, it's not practical, but you always move to get the best ones, the most important causes. And I'm going to show you three tools that we use when you're managing and structuring and organizing a problem-solving effort, which might have up to 100 or more engineers all around the world working on one problem, the really big ones. And this is the is-not analysis, or Kepner Tragoe. And basically what you do is you take myriad factors in the problem and you organize them under what, where, when, and extent, and you scrutinize them. And you look at what is the problem and what is not the problem. So an example might be if you have cardiac stents and model A, B, and C have worked well, but model D happens to have a lot of issues. Well, then the problem is model D and is not model A, B, C. And the distinctions in design are the things to focus on. So it doesn't mean you'll get the problem and you'll find the root cause, but it will point you towards the right factors to look at, to investigate. And basically, this tool integrates the logic of the problem. It analyzes correlations, scrutinizes coincidences, it highlights conflicts in the logic, and it prioritizes likely causes. And in the nutritional and medical world, it's kind of epidemiological studies would line up with this tool. But this is a very structured way to do it. This tool will end up with hundreds of entries. All must be scrutinized, because you may miss something otherwise. The second of 3 tools I'll show you is the root cause diagram. You don't need to read this. And it's one from a problem a few years ago that I was involved on, and this is an excerpt from it. And basically, I'm going to zoom in to show you the intents. So you have to put down the causal chain for all your proposed factors, right? In a multi-factor problem, there could be 10 things that are important and another 150 that are not. And the red circle shows where you've got a lot of evidence for a potential causal link in the chain. And then the grey with the red outline means you have substantial evidence, and the grey means you have very little evidence. So we also categorize within the diagram. Very importantly though, all your causal chain that A causes B, C, D, and then causes your ultimate problem, you've got to put on every arrow the scientific mechanism, the physics. If something causes something else, you must show what the mechanism is and prove there's science. That's the discipline in engineering. And it's a discipline that's missing in a lot of other places. So every link must have good scientific mechanisms. So in summary, the second tool, integrate the mechanisms, ensure sound science, leverage team expertise, highlight conflicts again, most importantly, prioritize the likely causes and downgrade unlikely hypotheses. It's very important to push down bad hypotheses or you'll waste time. Last tool, and again you don't have to read this, it's the hypothesis for against tool. And here's where you gather all of the evidence for a given hypothesis and against it. This shows one hypothesis. We might have 20 or 25 starting a big problem, and you need to get to the real one, okay? And basically you get the evidence for, evidence against, put it all down there, and always keep your eye on it and get the whole team engaged. Because if you miss out on evidence against, you'll waste your time and the business's money working on a BS hypothesis. And we've seen a few of those in the nutritional world, right? So in summary, weigh up the evidence base with this tool, leverage expertise again, scrutinize conflicts, very important, but most importantly, prioritize the best hypotheses and kill the weak ones, and don't waste time. So if you do these 3 tools very well and the master problem solver manages them and gets them all done really good, logs everything, right? Big team sessions, that's actually, as per Pareto, only 10% of the work. It's crucial, but it's only 10%, 20%. Most of the work occurs in integration. In integration, what we do is we use the most powerful optical microscopes in the world. We use scanning electron microscopes for our products to autopsy and analyze and find what's wrong. We do countless experiments, right, all well designed, and to find out what factors are more important. We do statistics, data mining on huge data sets. We also do statistical significance design of experiments, so we know we've got a real result and a real extent of impact from an experiment we do. We also do research. If we don't have the physics of what's going on in the problem, we do external research if we don't have prior art in that area. And we do emergency response. We do product recalls to protect the customer and to get parts back that have failed for autopsy with the scanning electron or with all the other tools we use. This is a feverish hotbed of activity because everything affects everything else. The parts you get back affect your experimental design, affect your learnings from autopsy. It's a miasma. It gets really intense. It's not for everyone, especially the big ones where there's a lot of money at stake. But if you do this part well, and you do it all properly and structured, what happens is you get rapid time to resolution and you get to the primary causes quickly, and they're the correct ones. And when you fix them, you put a robust fix in place for the business, and the problem doesn't reoccur. If you don't do this properly, what happens? Well, I'll tell you what happens. You get band-aids put in. And that's our term for a quick fix that seems to mitigate the problem and gets you out of a hole. But what happens is 6 months later, the band-aid slips, the problem reoccurs, people have moved on, and the business takes a hit. So we call problem-solving engineers who are poor, we call them band-aid merchants. And it's a very pejorative term, believe me, right? We do better than that. So part 2, when we look at this kind of structure, 5 years ago when I came into this heart disease and metabolism arena, I was inherently using these kind of tools and I learned rapidly. But we'll look at applying it. Again, Pareto principle always applies. Let's look at a little example of the first tool, the is not, Kepner, Tragoe. And we'll take the example of a huge increase in heart disease in humans in the last 100 years. And if we look at the what, well, it is primarily modernized humans, right? No one would argue with that. It is not traditional humans like Catavans, for example, right? We'd agree with that. They have no disease and they're incredible. The distinctions are many, but we'll pick one here, insulin levels and insulin resistance, right? That's a huge distinction. The Catavans have their insulin on the floor, they have their glucose on the floor, they are incredible, right? And the inferences we would have was insulin dynamics are important in this whole thing. Maybe not, but that's what this says. Interestingly, the is not can also tell you what it might not be, because the Catavans have the same or higher ApoB LDL particle count as the American adults. And the American adults have massive heart disease and the Catavans have none. But the Catavans have higher ApoB. So you would begin to say, well, ApoB probably doesn't mean much here, right? You would. Not proven, but you begin to say that. I'll give you an example of where. And again, there'll be hundreds of these lines in a real issue. It is in arteries, it's not in veins. That's interesting. The distinctions are oxygenation in the arteries, not in veins. Pressure, for sure, in arteries, not in veins. And vasovassorum, the little arterioles that feed the walls of the arteries, right? They're not so much in veins. And atherosclerosis only occurs where you've got these little feed arteries into the wall of the main artery. That's a distinction. And that would open up some very interesting avenues I won't get into here. But no one's looking at it in this way. One guy that did a bit of this way back he wrote the preeminent book on lipids and human health, Professor Michael I. Gurr, incredible biochemist and expert in lipids. And I recommend this paper written in '92, 50 pages. And after reading it, you'll have some new thoughts on the diet-heart hypothesis and on fats apart in heart disease. Fantastic paper. Back in '92, he debunked it basically. Oh, and this is his book. It's the preeminent book in biochemistry and lipids. So we'll go on to the second tool, root cause diagram, one of my favorites. And here I'll pick just one tendril of it. Excess fructose and excess glucose together, right, tend towards driving hyperinsulinemia chronically. And that tends towards adipocyte hypertrophy, or the swelling of your fat cells. And that causes a lot more signaling issues. Okay, so that's one. We'll continue the chain. The hypertrophy in your adipocytes, in your fat cells, the swelling, leads to increased visceral adipose tissue. The science is there in the literature for this. A dropping or a reduction in adiponectin, which is an insulin sensitizing hormone, very important. That goes into the toilet, right, when your fat cells get swollen. Your immune system, your IL-1 beta, and very important immune activation occurs with hypertrophy. And that has very big impacts on your systemic insulin resistance and your liver insulin resistance. And triglyceride tracking, right? Your lipoproteins that carry cholesterol, and Dave is going to talk to this later, they carry triglyceride. That whole system gets very badly impacted with hypertrophy, right? So all of this is good science. And the liver and systemic hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance that Catherine referred to, that leads through some great mechanisms in science, through many mechanisms, to atherogenic dyslipidemia, the low HDL, the high trigs, right? High particle counts. And that leads through many mechanisms directly to heart disease and atherosclerosis. Also, high blood pressure is a fact of life when you're hyperinsulinemic, largely. And that has many mechanisms. And higher insulin incorporates lipids in the arterial wall. Many, many published mechanisms around insulin driving atherosclerosis. And of course, elevated glucose if you're living in this world. And that has many mechanisms through ages and others. All leading towards heart disease. This is only one tiny part of the root cause. We'll add in a bunch of other stuff I won't go through, which all has mechanisms very solid into driving heart disease, okay? But many of these also have mechanistic science linking them to elevating your liver and your systemic insulin resistance, which in turn leads to heart disease. And that's one of the reasons we focus so much on hyperinsulinemia, because not only is it a major mechanistic driver, but many of the other drivers that drive heart disease in turn drive it. So it's a master measure for other dysfunction, right? That's why we're hot on it. Not the only cause, big one. What about artery clogging saturated fat, or LDL bad cholesterol, if we put it on this diagram, eh? Do you think that would have loads of amazing mechanisms that we'd be impressed by? Okay, go back and read Gerd's paper. Not really. Not impressing to an engineer anyway.
Ivor.
Yeah?
We have to reboot the live stream. Could you tell an Irish joke real quick?
Jeez. Now you got me. I was in full flow. Well, there was... Can I think of one? Oh, is it okay if it's not maybe perfectly politically correct? Well, did you hear about the Irish homosexual? He preferred women to Guinness. It's kind of okay. I don't know where that came from.
Almost there. That was a bit off-putting. Apologies.
Okay. Do I have to think of another?
It looks like it's coming back.
Okay, what's black and frizzled and hangs from the center of the ceiling? An Irish electrician.
Good.
Okay. So we've done the is not, we've done the root cause diagram, and the third tool is the hypothesis for against. And this is a small expert for cardiovascular disease. So we take a hypothesis that hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, and the two together are the problem, is a primary driver. The evidence for is very easy. I just touched on it here. Overwhelming epidemiological correlative data, incredibly impressive mechanistic data, truly impressive, huge amounts of it. Experimental evidence from animal and other studies. We don't really have RCTs for drugs because the drugs haven't really worked for hyperinsulinemia. It's a dietary disease, you got to fix it with diet. So we don't have those RCTs. We have experimental evidence though from many other factors. And the longest lived organisms in Cynthia Kenyon's and other papers, always defined by lower insulin. The longest lived humans also. So that list goes on and on. So we're solid. The evidence against, we got very little. Insulinoma patients who have a pancreatic tumor release a lot of insulin. The high insulin doesn't seem to cause as much dysfunction as you'd expect. So let's say that's against, but it's pretty weak, okay? So we check out, this is good. We got a good hypothesis. And gone again. Oh, back again. Okay, so we'll move on. This is LDL trying to defend itself here. We'll move on to bad cholesterol. Bad cholesterol LDL is the primary independent driver. The evidence for, we got loads of associational, but that's kind of weak evidence. The hazard ratios are weak. We've got mechanistic evidence, which is nowhere near insulin, but there is some mechanistic argument, right? We've got experimental RCTs with drugs that lower cholesterol, and they lower events. This is used a lot, but that's a correlation. They lower cholesterol, they lower events. The two are not necessarily linked. And there's some other stuff. You'll hear all this stuff. 4. So that's okay. But what about the against for LDL? Now it gets interesting. The hazard ratios are weak. Usually only people with really high LDL have a decent risk increase. And if you have a high HDL simultaneous, the risk disappears. Many studies show very little relationship. Case control, the people who get heart attacks, the people who don't. The LDL is hardly any different. Familial hypercholesterolemia, the people who die young of heart attacks versus the familial hypercholesterol people who live long and healthy, they got the same LDL, pretty much, in around 15 studies. In 20 studies, calcification of your coronary arteries, which is the ultimate indication of atherosclerosis extent, doesn't correlate with LDL in around 20 studies. I have the paper. So we could go on, but there's a mountain of evidence against it. So it essentially fails unless someone can explain all this. So up here we follow Pareto appropriately. Down below with LDL, maybe they're following someone else. I don't know. So that's a bit harsh. There is evidence for, but still. I hate the way they ignore the against. So part 3, halfway through, heart and chronic disease solution space. Again, we're going to follow Pareto, as we always do. So here's the simplified kind of potential causes, and I picked some of the big ones and what you do. Excess fructose, excess glucose. What you do, low carb, high fat. I'm sorry, Andreas, I robbed your the picture from the site, but you can see the delicious food. What you don't do primarily is carbohydrate excess, especially sugars and especially refined carbohydrates like breads and, refined basically explodes in your system. Bad thing. Processed foods you don't do, the bad processed foods with refined carb and vegetable oils. The main mechanisms there are insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, inflammatory vectors. Many mechanisms as to why you would do this. Next cause, suboptimum omega-3 DHA EPA, right? And excessive omega-6 fats, right? That's a primary concern. Do fatty fish, cod liver oil for people who don't like fish, right? That's a do, not too hard. Don't do vegetable oils, ever, right? That's just stupid. And again, don't do processed food, the bad processed foods, because they're stuffed with the refined carb and the vegetable oil, right? This is a no-brainer. And for the omega-3, omega-6, it's more inflammatory vectors and cellular damage when you incorporate omega-6 in the membranes, so slightly different mix. Suboptimum magnesium. There are many vitamins and minerals that we're short of in the last 100 years. Magnesium is a great example. What you do there is you eat foods rich in magnesium, like Brazils or dark chocolate. And you can also get magnesium citrate in bulk and we mix it with the stews for the whole family. It's tasteless and the whole family gets their magnesium and gets proficient or sufficient. Don't do processed food. Also alcohol and excessive sugar can deplete your magnesium. So that's the don't. And this is biochemical basics, right? You can look it up. Magnesium has huge interaction in so many reactions in the body that pertain to health. Last one, lack of UV, ultraviolet exposure. Vitamin D, nitric oxides released with UV on your skin. All the benefits of the ancestral sun. We're hearing now we got to avoid it like the plague. And that's a mistake. What you do is get healthy sun without burning. You can get UV lamps, which give you more benefits of UV than simply vitamin D supplements. But supplements are a backup in the winter if you can't get the other methods. You don't burn, that's stupid. And no processed food, again. And again, this is biochemical basis. And I'll finish this with saying, and so on. Depending on your risk tolerance and how obsessed you are with living long and healthy, you can move right down all the causes and fix them all. That's your choice. But I showed some top ones. Part 4, the final part, and this is a really important one. If you don't measure it, it don't get fixed. And the whole problem in our medical business today, I think, and certainly Catherine referred to the lack of measurements in insulin and postprandial insulin, that's a huge problem. But I'm going to show you a measurement that's grossly underused. And the measurement is the CT scan of the heart coronary calcium, right? On the left you see our sprightly Jeff there at 54 or 5. And in the green circle you can see in his scan he had 0 calcium in his coronary arteries. That's a 15-year warranty for a middle-aged person. Your event rates will be so low with a 0 in the following decades, relatively. It's called a human warranty. On the right, we see a guy with probably a score of 500, 600, 700, right? Left anterior descending, all chalked up. That's a high risk person. Here's some data from a recent study. If you look, you see on the top left, the 0 scores had 1 to 1.5% event rates in the following 10 years. These are middle-aged people. That's damn good. Down at the bottom with the high scores, over 1,000, 37%. So you got a 30-something X increase, multiplier, for risk for heart disease based on this amazing scan. Risk factors are 2X on a good day. Hundreds of thousands of subjects, so many studies, they all say the same thing. I'll show you a couple of interesting ones. Here you can see a study, I think around 65,000 people. On the left you have people with 0 risk factors, classic Framingham risk factors. All the way to the right, 3 or more risk factors. As you can see on average, if you forget the colour of the bars, there's an increased risk with more risk factors. Sure there is. It's pretty damn noisy. It's not a huge increase, but it's there. But if you look at the calcification results for those people, now you see CAC0, almost independent of risk factors, is relatively low risk. And look at the massive multiplier for having a high risk, or for having a high calcification score. Now that's an engineering measurement. And the reason is calcification scan looks at the actual disease itself in your heart. It's not a risk factor, it's not noise. Okay? This one here, young people, and calcification is recommended in the guidelines for middle risk, middle-aged people. But this study was interesting. It looked at younger people. As you can see, less than 4% risk in Framingham versus 5 to 11%. There's a higher risk with more risk factors. But they all got a calcification test, and look at the multiplier based on their calcification value. Whether you're low risk or medium risk, all of the multiplier is with your calcification result. So it's an incredible test. Pareto principle applies here too. 80% of cardiac events, broadly speaking, occur in the top 20% of cardiac calcification scores, right? Same thing applies with a proper test. You won't see that with risk factors. Quick story of my sponsor, David Bobbett. He was CEO, as I said, and owner of H&K International. 52 years old a few years ago, slim, fit, running 4 times a week. Doctors said he was bulletproof. Had around 15 executive medicals over a few years. All his bloods were good. Treadmill tests, ECGs, all the executive stuff. Fit as 10% for his age, bulletproof. Happened by coincidence to get a calcification scan, 906. Worst 1% for his age, 75% chance of a heart attack in the following 10 years, or death, right? 3% he was in Framingham. CAC supersedes all tests. Angio showed he had 4 majorly blocked arteries. He didn't take surgery, he took meds and lifestyle because he took 6 months off his business and discovered what a lot of you guys know. Heart disease is preventable, it's addressable. You can take care of it without getting major surgery in his case, even though 3 out of 4 arteries were fully blocked. He found out in a few months later he was diabetic, of course, undiagnosed, right? After meals, his blood glucose was shooting up to 300 and 400 milligrams, right? But he was undiagnosed. And he found out meds and nutrition, excellent path forward. So he invested a few $1 million in the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity. He's very proud of that and he's very passionate about it. And he funded the Widowmaker movie, $2 million movie, American movie. And we'll give all you guys a link to see it for free. Bottom line, middle risk, middle age, what do you do, right? That's a question for people who want to hang around for their kids, or even if you don't have kids, you want to hang around, you want to stay healthy, not just live longer. You want to live longer in a productive and dynamic way. So what do you do? Well, you get a single baseline calcification test, middle age. That's the ultimate decider, right? If you're a low score, congratulations, you did something good, right? Or you've good genetics, right? You continue to monitor blood tests over the years, and you do the things I said, maybe some more, but you don't need to be really wound up about it, right? Not so much wound up. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years later, pop back in, make sure the calcification has not jumped up inappropriately, make sure you haven't fallen off the wagon. You're still looking good. So that's easy. What do you do if you get a high score? Very high score. Now you're going to have to scrutinize those blood test results because you, like an engineer, are going to have to root cause the problem of why you got into that state, right, to have high amounts of heart disease. You're going to have to look at a lot of measures I don't have time to get into, and you're going to have to find out what your particular cause was or your top Pareto causes were. You may need meds as well, for sure. With established disease, they can mitigate your risk, at least until you know what's going on. You certainly tackle the top no-brainers from the science, like I showed you a few minutes ago. But you also probably want to move on down the Pareto, because you could have a special cause. You could be ApoE4, you could have sensitivities to animal fats and protein, which is something that's being studied at the moment. You could have heavy metal contamination, right? Independently will drive atherosclerosis and cellular damage. So you'll have to move on down the Pareto and find out what really caused your issue. If you were drinking Coca-Cola and smoking cigarettes for the last 30 years, right, it's not such a mystery. But what But what if, like David, you were healthy living, supposedly. David, of course, was eating a lot of carbohydrate, a ton of carbohydrate, as it turns out, because that's what the guidelines tell you. That's what gave him his diabetes. A couple of years later, you check back with CAC. Because you are a diseased person, you need to check back pretty quickly and make sure whatever you're doing now is working, right? That makes sense. And if you do all that and you do it properly, you're honoring Pareto. But if you want to go another route, there's always other people you can follow, right? Thank you.